President Cyril Ramaphosa says government, labor and business partners have 100 days to negotiate a social compact that's aimed at addressing deepening poverty, unemployment and inequality in South Africa. Speaking during the State of the Nation address last night, the President said that the situation is both unacceptable and unsustainable.
But equally, it is also an environment in which South Africans can live a better life and unleash the energy of their capabilities. This should also be a new consensus which embraces our shared responsibility to one another as South Africans and acknowledges that we are all in this together, and together we must find solutions that will take our nation forward. As the social partners, being government, labor, business and community-based entities, we are working to determine the actions we will take together to build such a consensus. We have begun discussions on what trade-offs are needed and what contribution we will each need to make to take this country forward.
Let's make sense of it now for you. Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya is the project director of the Indlulamithi Scenarios 2030, and that's at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. She joins us now via our video link for her thoughts on whether this new social consensus will work or not. And Xolelwa, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks so much indeed for making time. Let me begin by just getting your take on what has already been ventilated by some commentators who are saying that this phenomenon of creating task teams and social impacts is coming across as the president seemingly not trusting members of his own cabinet to carry out his mandate or his objectives. And so he's outsourcing this to people he does trust. Is that how you also see it?
Good morning, Ayanda, and also good morning to the viewers at home. Just my first response would be that's not how we see it. As the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection and also Indlulamithi, we've done quite a lot of work to conduct research on social compacting. And I think the main issue here is how to articulate what entails social compact, because the way it came across in the president's speech was as if there was this outsourcing to the private sector. However, social compacts are a very, formalized structure that doesn't just involve government and business alone. It also includes labor. It also includes civil society. And I mean, he got it right where in his opening, where he says all of us have to fall in, because it's everyone's responsibility to actually forge a compact. But there's a key and an essential step that is required before that. There has to be meaningful dialogue where we can find each other, because a compact should be informed by a common vision. And as it stands in our country, we're so diverse in our views and how we feel about our history, because the historical context also comes into play when you look at compacting, especially for fragile societies such as ours. So there has to be dialogue, society-wide dialogue, wherein we can determine what that common vision is, wherein we can also establish what the priorities would be. So there's no utility in having a top-down approach where priorities have already been determined without engaging with the whole of society. But also, I think another way of doing compacting that we found could be useful is to also have issue-specific compacts, or compacts that are localized to specific areas. So it could be a provincial compact. And I mean, a good example that the president mentioned was this of the hydrogen economy, which would be informed by our platinum mining sector. So that would be localized in the platinum belt or the northwest or Limpopo somewhat, where there is platinum mining there. And then how can you compact around that location? You know, the labor movements that are involved in platinum mining, how do they get involved? How do they become part of it? And the society, traditional leadership, communities at large. So it is actually flawed to actually think about a social compact as something that just entails government handing over to to the private sector. It is a collective agreement where everyone has to put something in and also be able to forgo some of the things they held on to so strongly.
Plenty of things you've ventilated there. And I guess there is value in promoting a collaborative approach to any kind of problem solving that takes place in society. But, I mean, in the past, what is our track record with moving these social compacts from discussions, collaboration, collective engineering, to actual material change? Because I think that's where the disillusionment is seeping in for many South Africans who've heard this term before, but still find it quite elusive.
A very good example of a moment of compacting for South Africa was the CODESA moment. Even though we did not call it a social compact then, but that moment wherein there was sufficient consensus, it was not full consensus, because I think that's another thing we need to caution against, this expectation that we are all going to eventually agree when after the dialogue and everyone has been involved. So during the CODESA moment, there was sufficient agreement and we could take the country forward. And there were other follow-up instances where the country had compact-like moments like the Job Summit. But once again, what we saw there was business, big business, pledging all sorts of amounts, but there was no follow-up and no one could hold big business accountable for what they had pledged in terms of job creation. So that is something that we identified as a flaw, that there's no sanctioning. Another moment of compacting came organically through COVID, wherein we saw NEDLEC rising to the occasion. Because if you recall, post-1994, the NEDLEC Act actually required NEDLEC to be formed, but also to be the formal structure for social compacting, where labor sits, government, communities, and so on. Then during that moment, we saw how the president even mentioned, the Solidarity Fund and so on, and many other efforts, protective gear for healthcare workers. All of those happened through those negotiations that were taking place at NEDLEC. But now the question that we need to ask is whether NEDLEC is fit for purpose to take forward the project of social compacting in our country, because then we're dealing with a global pandemic, and it seems like everyone was compelled to fall in. But can we take it forward? Is there longevity for the NEDLEC, especially as it's located within, well, aligned to the Department of Labor and not necessarily accountable to the presidency? So those things need to be addressed, and also the issue of representation at the NEDLEC, because we find that civil society is not sufficiently represented there. There's a dominance by labor and business, and so the engagements there tend to be biased towards that.
So in this particular case, the president has given himself and those he works with 100 days to come up with this comprehensive social compact that's aimed at dealing with the economy, jobs, and hunger in the country. To a point you've already made in some respects, how do we, as ordinary South Africans, at the end of this 100 days, hold him accountable for something like this?
I mean, I think it is good that, time frames were actually assigned to this, because this is something that was actually quite interesting about the SONA, that there were specific time frames that were provided. But I'm not too sure if 100 days is sufficient or nearly sufficient, because as I've mentioned, there has to be dialogue wherein society has to be brought on board. Because if you listen to the commentary, even after SONA, there seems to be no understanding of what this compacting is. So if maybe they could spend some time to bring everyone up to speed, but also for themselves as government to understand, what is the meaning of a social compact, what it would take. So the process has to be nurtured, and there has to be dialogue. And also, once again, we need to have everyone involved in terms of prioritization and identifying what the challenges would be, or what that North Star would be. So far, the only thing we can say the president has is probably the Constitution, but is that what society at large believes to be our North Star? So there has to be nationwide dialogue. I'm not sure how they can do that, but it would be essential. It's very essential before any compacting effort is done, that there has to be this dialogue.
Xolelwa Kashe-Katiya, lovely speaking to you on this Friday morning. Thanks very much indeed for helping us connect the dots. Really do appreciate your time. Xolelwa is the project manager of Indlulamithi Scenarios 2030. That's with the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Once again, thanks very much indeed.